Take a look at this chart. It shows who really won from globalization between 1988 and 2008, based on how much incomes grew. That big group in the middle? That's mostly China, where hundreds of millions of people escaped poverty and entered the middle class. But then there's one group that got left behind: the lower middle class in the US and other Western countries. Their incomes barely moved. Meanwhile, the top 1%, their incomes shot up, matching the Chinese middle class's gains. So what's going on here? Who is really winning from globalization? Actually, this chart explains a lot about why Trump got elected and why he's slapping tariffs on other countries right now. So let's get into it. China wants to push the story that everyone benefits from manufacturing in China. But when you start looking at the facts and the numbers, you realize that China's story is just a propaganda lie. Now, I'm sure the CCP bot army will not be happy with this video exposing China's lies. So, if you can please help me fight the bot army by hitting that like and subscribe button down below. Everything you do helps our videos survive on the YouTube system. So, the story begins in 1947. Just after World War II had ended, members of the United Nations gathered in Switzerland to sign a historic document called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. 23 countries worldwide agreed to cut the amount of tariffs they charged on international trade, and the US government in Washington was taking the lead in this. At this time, Europe and Asia were still in ruins, and the Global South hadn't yet industrialized. So in the late 1940s, the US accounted for more than half of global GDP, an unprecedented monopoly. Also, because it had the biggest navy in the world, the US could also serve as the guarantor of free trade routes. The US wanted to use this as a tool for soft power. By opening up trade with other nations in Europe and Asia, America would become very popular abroad. But apart from this geopolitical consideration, there was another reason to promote free trade. According to the economic theory of comparative advantages, free trade would lead to economic growth. We won't bore you with the details, but basically it goes like this. If every country produces the goods and services it's best at, the idea is that everyone will get more goods and services overall. So, in order to achieve this, international trade restrictions were removed bit by bit. On this chart, we can see the average tariff on imports the US charged over time. Back in the 1800s, the US was charging up to 57% on imports. By 1947, this average rate dropped to 7.9%. And by 1995, the average tariff rate was slashed to 2.5%. This was an important year, because on the 1st of January in 1995, the World Trade Organization was created. Headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, the WTO's main goal is to reduce tariffs worldwide and to cut other forms of trade barriers. It currently has 166 members, covering 98% of global GDP and 93% of the global population. Ever since 1995, the US tariffs on imports have dropped even further, going down to less than 1.5% in the 2010s. This steady decrease in import tariffs allowed globalization to really set in. As we can see on this chart from 1950 to 2023, global trade volume has increased by 4,400%. This had a huge positive impact on GDP for every country on Earth, with global GDP going from $12 trillion in 1950 to $167 trillion now, as measured in 2021 dollars. Sounds great, right? But these numbers might oversimplify reality just a little bit. To understand this, we have to look at the US trade balance. Basically, it's the balance of how much the US sells to other nations minus how much it buys from other nations. Only that selling is called exporting and buying is called importing. And on this chart, we can see the US trade balance over the years. It's negative, and it's going down rapidly. The US is importing way more goods and services than it's exporting. It has gotten so extreme that in 2024, the total trade deficit in goods was $1.2 trillion US dollars. This trade deficit really started to take root in the 70s and 80s. Back then, it was mostly Japan who was getting money out of the US, dominating US imports with its cars and electronics. As a result, Japan had become the world's second biggest economy, and people were saying it could get ahead of the US sometime in the future. Sounds familiar, right? As you can imagine, not everyone liked what Japan was doing. That included one businessman in New York named Donald Trump. He was pretty famous on TV already, and during a 1998 interview, he had some thoughts about Japan. He said that, "We let Japan come in and dump everything right into our markets. It's not free trade. If you ever go to Japan right now and try to sell something, forget about it. Just forget about it. It's almost impossible." What he was pointing to is that Japan charged higher tariffs on US goods than the US did on Japanese goods. On top of that, there was a ton of legislation in Japan making it difficult for US companies to enter, which is called a technical barrier to entry. That's not really free trade. Of course, in 2025, Japan isn't on top of everyone's mind anymore in the US. Nowadays, the real problem lies with China. China saw a huge economic rise in the 1990s due to internal reforms and its abundance of cheap labor that made the country insanely competitive for manufacturing. So lots and lots of companies outsourced their manufacturing to China, leading to a huge Chinese export boom. And a lot of these exports were going to the United States, making China the largest exporter to the US. But by 2028, this led to a trade deficit of $419 billion, the highest value ever, amounting to about 2% of US's GDP. China is by far the biggest contributor to the total trade deficit, but other countries like Mexico, Vietnam, Germany, Japan, and Canada also add hundreds of billions to the deficit. However, it is fair to mention that a good share of the exports from Mexico, Vietnam, and Canada are actually Chinese goods that take an elaborate route to avoid US tariffs. So the real deficit with China is actually much bigger, especially if you look at numbers from after 2018 when the trade war escalated. The 2024 figures say that America's trade deficit with China is less than $300 billion, but it's way higher if we take into account this rerouting of goods. Now, the reason why many people are talking about this trade deficit is because it's a jobs issue. Because all of the production is shifting to China, wages in China are going up, while the American lower middle class incomes are falling behind. More on that later. But first, it's important to get the facts straight. You see, what's happening in China is not really free trade. Back in 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, the CCP promised to open up its markets and adhere to some basic trade rules. But in the 24 years since, it hasn't adhered to these agreements at all. First of all, China promised to cut its tariffs to open its market to foreign companies. But in the 2000s, the country still had an average tariff rate of around 5%. And in the 2010s, it was charging 3 to 5% on imports. Meanwhile, the US was only charging 1.5%, giving Chinese companies an unfair advantage over American ones. Also, if you're an American company trying to do business in China, good luck. China uses excessive regulation to make it hard for American companies to sell their goods, just like Japan did in the past. This practice of a technical barrier to entry is illegal under the WTO rules, but it happens anyway. Also, in many strategic industries, the only chance American businesses have in China is when they start a joint venture with a Chinese company. This way, the Chinese company then gets a majority stake, and they demand that production and investments happen in China, and that the American business shares its intellectual property. And the problem of intellectual property is way bigger than this. Many Chinese actors are stealing IP from American companies through cyber operations. The American government estimates that IP theft is costing the US $600 billion annually, with the accumulated costs over the years running into the trillions. IP theft is actually way more costly to the American economy than the trade deficit itself. It's one of the reasons why Chinese companies have been able to innovate so quickly. Disrespecting IP rights is another red line that China shouldn't have crossed as part of the WTO. After all, you can't steal the trade secrets of American businesses and then take their market by selling to the American consumer. Another broken promise was that China said it would shift away from its state-controlled economic model. According to the United States Trade Representative, this is one of the biggest problems about trading with China. A 2024 report said that China continues to represent the biggest challenge to the international trading system. After 23 years of membership in the WTO, China still embraces a state-directed, non-market approach to the economy and trade, which runs counter to the norms and principles embodied in the WTO. And that's a fair point. State-owned enterprises account for 40% of GDP in China, and every so-called private Chinese corporation has a CCP board at the top of their company structure. Now, you might wonder why the WTO would care about China's economic system. The issue is that China can use its free access to the American markets in an uncompetitive way. Take steel, for example. China uses tax policy, cheap loans from state banks, and political control over steel manufacturers to massively overproduce steel. This allowed China to dump steel abroad, killing many steel plants in the West. This didn't happen organically at all, and it comes at a huge economic and strategic cost to the US. Similar things happened with solar panels and electric vehicles. And right now, China is trying to do it with AI and semiconductors. All of this combined with a toxic mix of China stealing American IP rights, keeping foreign businesses out, and giving its own businesses a leg up, contributes to this huge and growing trade deficit for the US. That's not free trade. That's ripping off your competitor. And all of this is hitting one group very hard, namely lower middle income class Americans. To understand this, we need to go back to the chart we started with. Because from 1988 to 2008, the Asian middle class and the global top 1% have grown their real income by more than 80%. But the lower middle income class in Western countries, including the United States, saw close to no growth. In part, this can be explained by the trade deficit. Many lower-income middle Americans used to work in factories that have mostly gone to China. Ever since China really took off, the industrial output in the US has almost stagnated, and employment in the industrial sector has collapsed. The trade deficit with China alone led to the loss of 3.7 million jobs in the US between 2001 and 2018, according to the Economic Policy Institute. For comparison, that's about the population of LA. For many of these people, losing their manufacturing jobs has led to a permanent loss of income. But currently, the unemployment rate is at historic lows, so those manufacturing jobs have been replaced. However, a bigger problem is that wage growth has stagnated. If we take a look at this chart, we can see that the bottom 90% of income earners in the US are barely getting ahead in real income. Adjusted for inflation, their income is growing by less than 0.5% per year. And that's the bottom 90% of Americans. The people in the bottom 50% are even worse off. Meanwhile, the people in the top 1% have seen almost 10 times the real wage growth. This phenomenon we see in the US actually relates to the growing trade deficit. You see, outsourcing manufacturing to China mainly benefits the people at top positions. A CEO of a multinational company can score a big bonus if his production costs drop to a fraction of what they were. Engineers working at tech giants like Apple are also much more valuable nowadays, because their designs can be made in China for dirt cheap. And the list goes on, with CFOs, supply chain executives, and investors all making bank on trade with China. Whether doing business with China is good for them in the long term is an entirely different question. China will undoubtedly try to undermine American companies, which will hurt even the richest Americans. But at the moment, American dollars are either going to foreign low-skilled jobs or to domestic high-skilled jobs, while the low middle-income class in America is left behind. And we don't see this if we just look at GDP numbers. It's true that both China and the United States have grown their GDP by a lot over the last 2 decades. So the economists saying that free trade leads to economic growth technically are totally right. But if one American earns $1 million more and 99 other Americans are barely keeping up with inflation, not everyone is happy. This story is largely why Trump got the majority of the vote in the 2024 election. His message on being tough on China and bringing back jobs resonates with the Rust Belt, with Trump winning in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin, some of the most crucial swing states. And as we all know, he's currently using tariffs to try to deliver on his promise. Basically, tariffs protect domestic industries against foreign ones and make American manufacturing more competitive despite higher labor costs. It's also a source of government revenue, which allows the Trump administration to supposedly cut income taxes. This strategy is called protectionism, and it's been used time and time again in the past. But the historical precedents are very mixed, making protectionism a very controversial policy. There's a whole list of countries where protectionism has worked, namely in the US in its early days, in Germany in the 19th century, and in Japan, South Korea, and China in recent times. But all these countries were still underdeveloped when they adopted protectionism. It makes sense to shield domestic industries when they are still uncompetitive, to give them time to grow. But shielding domestic industries can also go very wrong. Countries like Brazil, India, and especially Argentina had a bad time when they tried to use tariffs. The populist Argentinian leader Juan Perón has used tariffs in detrimental ways, destroying Argentina's long-term success. The danger with protectionism is always that domestic industries don't have any incentive to become more competitive. Also, if you shut yourself off from other countries, you also won't be able to sell goods to others, which can be pretty devastating. However, if the current trade policy doesn't change, the US lower middle-income class will probably continue to fall behind. So it's clear that this free trade issue is insanely complicated. And if it wasn't already complicated enough, we should also take a second look at the trade deficit itself. Because if it gets out of hand, it won't only lead to stagnation for the lower middle-income class, it will mean that America gets bought out. When America buys more than it sells, inevitably, countries like China end up with a surplus of dollars. China actually uses these dollars to invest back into the US. They put their cash into things like US treasuries, corporate debt, or even the stock market. Chinese investors also buy massive amounts of US farmland and US real estate. In this way, the dollars flow back to the United States in what economists call the balance of payments. Of course, this isn't bad by definition. It actually shows that the US is popular as an investment location, and the trade deficit actually helps to lower prices for US consumers. But it can get out of hand. Right now, 24% of US government debt is owned by foreigners, including Chinese investors. The same goes for corporate debt, which is 30% foreign-owned, and the stock market, which is 20% foreign-owned. And in real estate, there's a similar development. Over the years, about 10% of US residential property sales have gone to Chinese investors. In total, foreign investors have bought $1.2 trillion worth of homes in the US over the last 15 years. Also, over 40 million acres of agricultural land in the US is now owned by foreigners, which is about the size of the state of Washington. If foreign investors, and especially Chinese ones, continue to pile up assets in the US, there might be a problem. After all, you don't want the government and private companies to be massively indebted to China. You also don't want China to become America's landlord, owning a whole lot of farmland and residential properties. That would be a massive weakness in this geopolitical competition between the world's two biggest powers. All right, if you want to stay informed about this China-US trade war, please subscribe to the channel. YouTube just dropped a mind-boggling announcement. It is paying creators $64 million per day. Why? Well, because YouTube doesn't have enough creators. That is why you see videos on your homepage that have less than 1,000 views, like this one. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everyone should start a channel, but if you have ever wondered about starting a YouTube channel, or a faceless YouTube channel like this one, well, now's the perfect time. YouTube is paying creators millions every day, and it's pushing newer, smaller channels now more than ever. But I'm sure many of you have questions on how to get started and how to grow a channel. We get questions in our email all the time from some of you guys. So that's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one training bootcamp for the low price of completely free. So, if you're someone interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can sign up for this bootcamp by clicking on the link in the description or on the screen. Sign up now because, unfortunately, unlike YouTube videos, the bootcamp is like a Zoom call, so it's limited to just 100 people. Okay, let's get back to the video.